Welcome to the 14th Annual Statewide Toward Zero Deaths Conference. My name is Ginger Steele, and I feel honored to be serving in the acting position of Interim Director of the Office of Traffic Safety and the co-chair of the TZD program. I also feel fortunate to be able to introduce the Minnesota State Patrol Honor Guard, members who will present the United States and Minnesota flags. Please rise for the posting of the colors. Please be seated. Before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors. This conference is made possible by the Minnesota Toward Zero Deaths program and the Minnesota Departments of Public Safety, Transportation, and Health, with funding from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, otherwise known as NHTSA. I'm also pleased to share that additional funding for the conference has been provided by our silver level sponsor, WSB, and also by our bronze level sponsors, LifeLink 3, Regions Hospital, Children's Minnesota, AAA, the Northland chapter of the American Traffic Safety Services Association, and Fairview. These sponsors have financially supported this conference and have helped to offset the registration costs to keep it affordable for all of us. A sincere thank you. I'd also like to share some other important information related to the conference. If you're seeking post credit, you must sign the post roster at the registration desk in order to receive full credit. If you have questions, please ask registration staff. To enhance your conference experience, we are continuing the Guidebook Mobile App. You can view the conference schedule, description, speakers, exhibitors, connect with other participants, and more. This app is compatible with most mobile devices. For more information, please see the conference program, and if you have any questions, please contact the registration staff. Also, TZD is on social media. Follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. You can easily search MN TZD on either side for our accounts. We continue to use social media to engage a broader audience and spread the word about TZD and safety. We hope you're able to do that with us. You can see our MNTZD 2017 hashtag on several conference materials. Please use it and get us trending. Finally, I have a note here that session 37 is actually being swapped out. Originally, it was the anatomy of a DWI crash, and now it'll be situational awareness, Perham area EMS emergency, and that'll be in room 8. And the conference mobile app and the room signage will reflect this change. So, onward. What a spectacular turnout today. It's really great to see everyone, and I'm glad you're here. I have identified 2 words that I'll repeat a lot in the next few minutes. I consider these 2 words pretty unsophisticated, yet they pack a big punch. 2 of the words are a lot. I'm sorry to those of you who thought that a lot was 1 word up until today. You ask why I would say the 2 words a lot. Because the last I heard, a lot of people had registered for this conference, a lot meaning around 900. That's a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, a lot of ideas, opportunities to learn from each other. We need these opportunities because the state of Minnesota has a lot of traffic fatalities. In fact, as of yesterday, 289 to date in 2017. It's 289 fatalities. It's not to say we haven't made a lot of progress. Many of you may be familiar with the graphic, which I'll put up here. So both of these statements are true. We've made a lot of progress in reducing traffic fatalities, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. Losing one family member or friend to a traffic-related crash is a lot. So please utilize this conference here to learn to network, to share, to become energized. Let's recommit our allegiance toward 0 deaths. I truly hope you like the conference a lot. At last, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Jim Headland. He's our keynote speaker for this morning's opening plenary session. His presentation is titled Autonomous Vehicle and Traffic Safety Promises and Challenges. Jim is principal at Highway Safety North based in Ithaca, New York. He consults on behavior traffic safety research, policy, and management. Jim spent 22 years at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, retiring as Associate Administrator for Traffic Programs. His work includes drug-impaired driving, a guide for what states can do, autonomous vehicles meet human drivers, traffic safety issues for states, and countermeasures that work. Please join me in welcoming Jim.
Thank you, Ginger. Thanks very much, and good morning. I'm always glad to be back in Minnesota. You'll see by my name there, it's a good Swedish name. But no, it doesn't come from Minnesota, it comes from Nebraska. Sorry about that. And I also want to congratulate Minnesota because last year, your traffic fatalities dropped by almost 5%. You were one of the very few states that managed to have fewer traffic fatalities in 2016 than 2015. The nation as a whole went up by 5%. So good work and keep it up. I've been asked to talk about autonomous vehicles, and I shall do that in the next 25 minutes or so, and here's the very brief outline. What is one of these things? What do you see now? What's coming soon? What do the public think about it? What are the issues? And then the important stuff comes later. What are the issues for you in Minnesota and for other states as autonomous vehicles come around? I'm not an expert on this. I'm in this business because about a year and a half ago, the Governor's Highway Safety Association, that's that little logo at the bottom, GHSA, they are the association of all the state highway safety offices. They have a little office in Washington. They said, Jim, you know, autonomous vehicles are coming. A lot of states don't know a lot about them or have some idea of what they should think about. Are you willing to write a report for us on this? Pitched for states, not techie, not legal, but what should states know and what should states do? And being gullible, I said yes. And this was the result. It was released last February. It's available from the GHSA website. I'll give you the web link at the very end. Again, this is written for states, so I hope it's understandable to you and everyone that you deal with. And this is the way that most people start thinking about this. Yeah, autonomous, it's self-driving. It'll solve all of our problems. When all the vehicles are autonomous, transportation won't become something you have to own and keep in your garage. It'll be a service. Much the same way, if I go to a different city, I want food, I go out, I get the food at a restaurant. I don't have to bring the food with me and cook it myself. And there won't be any crashes due to driver error, and arguably over 90% of crashes are due to driver error. And everything is happening very rapidly. Half the states have passed laws dealing with autonomous vehicles, either their testing or their operation. Here's the map of what they look like, just spread around the country. So, yeah, it's no problem. It will happen, right? Not quite. So let's talk a little bit about the complications, and I'll take 2 steps back and do AV 101. You probably all know this, but here it is anyway. What is an autonomous vehicle? Level 1 is just simple-minded things like cruise control. Level 2, occasional self-driving, typically cruise control, lane control, and so forth. Driver is supposed to be thoroughly in control of all of these at all times, though it has not been. Tesla is an example of a level 2, and there are recorded instances of Tesla drivers playing pat a cake, or talking on their cell phone, of course, or even riding on the roof. Level 3 is where things get interesting. Limited self-driving in some situations, but again, the driver must be there, and the vehicle tells the driver, hey, I'm coming to a situation where I can't handle it, you have to take charge. This is a really tricky one, because how long does it take someone to become in charge when he hasn't been, or she hasn't been at the moment? Level 4, full self-driving for the whole trip under appropriate conditions, and the appropriate conditions are called their operational design domain, or ODD. These can be geographic. It can operate within a limited urban area, for example, with low speed limits. It can also involve things like weather. I can operate fine as long as it's not snowing, but as soon as the road gets covered with snow, I can't operate anymore. And level 5 is what everybody thinks about when they talk about autonomous vehicles. This is full self-driving at all times. The vehicle's completely in control and can do its stuff. What's around now? Level 2, Teslas do this, as I said. Level 3, coming soon. When I put these slides together, the Waymo test fleet had 3 million miles of driving under its belt. It now has more than 3.5 million. There are more than 40 companies testing in California right now. These range everywhere from typical automobile manufacturers like GM, Ford, Chrysler, to the tech companies like Google and so forth, to startups. So they're all over the map. Predictions have been made by a number of companies that they will have something commercially available by 2020 or very shortly thereafter, and these are just a list of some of the ones that have said that. How does it work? This is taken from Waymo, Google's most recent report on how they deal with safety. But these are the 4 steps of how an autonomous vehicle operates. First, it begins with a map. And it will not drive on any road, certainly for Waymo at the moment, that it is not mapped in great detail. This is far more than a Google Maps. This is knowing where everything is, every post is, every traffic signal is, every road marking is, and so forth. Then, when the vehicle gets to a position, it senses what's around it. The picture, which is somewhat cut off in the bottom, is a video view of what the vehicle sees out front. And The things that you see on the schematic there, the green and the purple and so forth, are the diagrams of the things it sees: the buses, the cars, the pedestrians, the bicycles, and so forth. Then, because this just isn't a static thing but a dynamic thing, it has tracked all of the things that move in this environment. It senses not only where they are, but where they're going, what their speed is, and makes predictions based on what they will do next. Is this vehicle going to turn left? Is it going to turn left in front of me, and so forth? And after that, it chooses its route and its speed. So it's a very complicated operation. There's a lot of software involved in this, and the vehicle makes those kinds of calculations every instant, microseconds, not just seconds. Okay, big question. What is coming and when? This is a compilation of projections from a number of sources. They are based on several things: the development of the technology and the promises of the people that make it, the rate of turnover for vehicles. I mean, you buy a car, the car can last for 15 years now, quite easily, in fact, longer than that. The price point, because initially autonomous vehicles will be more expensive than ordinary vehicles, and the rate of introduction of other vehicle technology into the vehicle fleet. So the guess is in the 2020s there won't be too many of these around, typically probably in commercial operations rather than individual owners. 2030s they'll begin to be around 10 to 20% of the fleet, and not till the 2050s will they get to the level of a majority of the vehicle fleet. So again, these are arguable, these are guesses, nobody really knows. It's, as Yogi Berra once said, it's really hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So that's what we're sitting here, but I want you to come away with one takeaway from that. There will be a mix of autonomous and regular vehicles on the road for a good long time. Here's another factor in how quickly they will be on the road. What does the public think about them? This is a compilation of 4 surveys. There have been a couple more since then, but they're pretty consistent. The public is skeptical of AVs. Would you ride in an AV today? Only 17% said yes and 75% said no. Would you buy one? 20 yes, 50 no. So a reasonable amount of skepticism there. And the bottom line is an important one. Prefer AVs that allow a driver to take control when the driver wants to. I may be perfectly happy using my AV to commute back and forth to work every day. I don't need to think about that. I want to do something else. But I want to take my old Mustang out on the road on the weekend and drive it myself. So this adds to the idea that no, the public won't jump toward AVs instantly as soon as they're available. Now, having said all that, new technology can indeed jump into the public and become quickly accepting. You know what this thing is, yes? 15 years ago, it didn't exist. Now, I will bet lunch that everybody in this room has one. Am I right? You owe me lunch. So, yes, they can come in, things can move very rapidly if the conditions are right. So my takeaway, and the thing I want to leave with you, is there will be a mix for a reasonable amount of time, and that's what you as highway safety professionals need to be prepared for. How do I deal with an AV and an ordinary driver vehicle and the interactions between them? Much less the AV and the pedestrians and the bicycles and all of the other road users, the dog that runs across the road. So that's the challenge. It's human behavior. It always has been human behavior. And here are 3 examples. These are real. These are crashes that have occurred with AVs. There have been, something over 40 crashes in California alone. Most of them low speed. But here are 3. You've probably all heard of the Tesla Fatality a couple of years ago. That's a level 2 AV. The driver should have been paying full attention. There was an extensive report on this, an investigation done by the National Transportation Safety Board. That report concluded that the driver had his hands off the steering wheel for more than 36 minutes out of 37 before the crash. He ignored many warnings from the vehicle, take charge. He was just oblivious, and he ran sideways into a semi-trailer and died. Second one, a Waymo car. He was in a middle lane of traffic, and there was a left lane to the left of him. Traffic was stopped in front of the Waymo car, and it pulled out into the left lane, assuming that there was no traffic coming from behind. And the driver of a bus coming from behind was driving along and assumed that the Waymo car would not pull out. Consequence, a crash. Bad assumptions on both sides. Bad assumption by the bus driver, bad assumption by the Waymo car. Finally, an Uber car, the picture of this one is on the bottom there. The picture on the top is the Tesla Fatality. The Uber car was in the leftmost of 3 traffic lanes, and the traffic again was stopped in the lane in front of him and the lane to the right. And in fact, I believe it's the case there was a semi-trailer in front of him. So the three lanes, 2 stopped, Waymo car, Uber car here. A driver was approaching across the side on a cross street. View was blocked by the semi-trailer. Driver kept going straight across. Uber car kept going. Driver T-boned the Uber car. Not a fatality, but not good. And again, this one, the Uber car was doing precisely what it was supposed to be doing, but the driver in the other car assumed that there would be nothing coming in that third lane, and was quite wrong. There have been documented instances of kids running in front of AVs because I know it'll stop and I want to make it do a trick for me. Or of drivers at two-way intersections saying, well, that's an autonomous vehicle, so I can just go ahead, it'll wait for me. This interaction of behavior between the two kinds of drivers is going to be very interesting. And there's an institutional challenge as well, because this is really disruptive technology. I'll give you 2 just little quips about this. First is the hardware versus software problem. Cars traditionally have been hardware. They're pieces of metal and other things. They're made, they sit there, they don't change very much. But an AV is hardware and software. Once the software is in the car, I can push a button back at headquarters and change the characteristics of that car. How does a DMV deal with this? How does the licensing deal with this? And it also blurs the role between the feds and the states. Traditionally, the federal role has been to regulate vehicles. That's what NHTSA does. It has vehicle safety standards. It has vehicle recalls for defects. It does that. And the state role, there it is. You license the vehicles and drivers. You do the laws. You do the enforcement. But if I have an autonomous vehicle, particularly a level 4 or a level 5 one that is not under human control, who is the driver? Is it a person in the car? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the person that owns the car? Interesting issues. Again, there are many new players here. We're not just trying to regulate or deal with 3 original equipment manufacturers, which you've got tons of folks out there doing that. And it's all going very rapidly. So let me now raise a bunch of questions and things for you to consider. They're questions, they're issues, they're not answers, and we'll have a little panel here afterwards to discuss some of these. But there are 2 phases, and one is testing and one is operations. The top line is the real thing that you have to keep in mind. Encourage the testing while protecting the public safety. You definitely want to encourage the testing because the societal benefits of AVs, once they really come into play, are enormous. And I won't take the time to work through all of them here, but they really will be enormous. But remember that the final testing is on public roads, and there will be this mix of AVs being tested and folks on the road. Is there an application process? How and when? Who must be a driver of the test vehicles, reporting to you, and so forth? States have taken a wide variety of approaches to this question, from the very strictly regulatory ones. New York, where I come from, is one that has very tight regulations about testing. As a result, there are only 2 firms that are testing in New York, and they've each done 1 test drive apiece. California is fairly strict, although California has lots of folks testing there. Other states are quite loose and saying basically if you are a company and you can provide an insurance bond, you can go ahead and test anything any way you want. So consider how you wish to allow testing in Minnesota. At present, all testing still has a test driver in the vehicle who can take charge if there's an emergency situation or if something starts going wrong, and of course who's there to record what's going on and help out. Next year that will end, because California has regs out for public comment right now to allow driverless testing on its public roads. The best word from California is that this probably will be final regs by the end of this year, and there probably will be driverless testing sometime next spring. So it's happening very rapidly. These sorts of issues are set out very nicely in NHTSA's recent policy document released in September that says here are things for states to consider, and they have a number of issues quite nicely described there that I've just attempted to summarize here. Now when we get to operations, things get much more interesting. Who's the driver, and how do you license and train level 3 and 4 drivers? There's probably a general consensus that if you're in a level 3, you definitely need standard driver training, but you also need to know how your AV works. How do you train somebody on how your AV works when there are many different versions of AV put out by many different manufacturers? There's no standard curriculum there. Level 4, again, must be able to operate autonomously within its established domain, but outside the established domain, a human must drive it. Domain, what does that mean? Well, sometimes it's a geographical area, limited by, geofenced, if you will, limited by speed limit and so forth. But it also can involve things like weather conditions. When it starts snowing, I'm outside my domain, I can't handle it anymore. So human, you must take over. That's the operational design domain. Your data systems need to figure out how to keep track of AVs and keep track of what level they are, where they can operate, and so forth. And how do you track the software changes? Because as you well know, software changes. Your laptop gets updates regularly from whomever runs your laptop and said, okay, shut it down, establish the new system, and keep on going. That'll happen to your AV too. It will get regular updates. How do you as a state keep track of these? Laws. You will definitely need to look at your laws to figure out how they will accommodate AV. Who's the driver? We've mentioned this. Laws and ordinary traffic laws. I give you speed limits as an example. To date, all the AVs are programmed strictly to obey the speed limits. Now, do human drivers strictly obey the speed limits all the time? I could take a poll, but I won't embarrass you, of how many people strictly obeyed the speed limit all the time on your drive in here this morning. I didn't drive, so I'm exempt from that. But really, should I program the AV strictly to obey the speed limit, which will make a lot of people mad at it, prompt some road rage, especially on 2-lane roads where you get this big stack behind the car driving 55 and everybody else is driving 60. Or do I consciously program the AV to disobey the speed limit? And there's a nice little ethical dilemma there. How about distracted driving laws? You don't have a cell phone law, I believe, but you do have a texting law, yes? Should I allow texting in a level 4 AV or a level 3 AV when it's operating appropriately? How do you enforce a texting? Let's suppose you don't. How do you enforce that? If you're an officer at the side of the road and I see a car going by and the driver is texting, well, is this an AV at level 3 or at level 4 or level 5 where it's perfectly legal? Or is it not, and I should pull the driver over? Impaired driving laws, you can figure that one out. From law enforcement perspective, how do I identify these things on the road? How do I flag one down if I want to? How do I pursue one and get it to pull over? The road rage we've mentioned previously, and if you want to go into the slightly more problematic but really scary issues, how do you get one of these suspected of carrying contraband? How do you worry about hackers? I mean, if they can hack your computer, why can't they hack your car and tell it to do all sorts of things you don't want it to do? Crash investigation, law enforcement needs to really worry about this. How do I identify them? How do I make sure the vehicle is stopped? Do I make sure it's not going to all of a sudden start up and go home? How do I deal with the things that you must need to deal with at a traffic stop or a crash? I mean, currently, your law says the driver will provide certain information for you. Well, who's the driver? How do you get this information? And then, of course, safety for law enforcement and emergency responders. I won't talk about liability insurance because that's not a safety issue, but it's a huge issue that the lawyers are worrying up, down, and sideways. But I will mention the coordination across states. Currently, I can take my car and I can drive from New York to California across all the states, and I know there will be various state laws that'll change a little bit and the speed limits might change, but I'm perfectly comfortable doing this. And I know that my vehicle registration and my driver license from New York will be accepted in the states that I drive across. How will that work for AVs? If you establish special requirements for AVs, that means you can't drive one from one state to the next. Here's my general advice to you as a state. Number one is crucially important: be informed and stay informed. This stuff is moving so rapidly, you just have to keep after it. I strongly suggest you, and I think you already have, having a task force or a working group or someone within your state DOT that deals with AVs, and involve the manufacturers and the ones that want to test in your state in that, because they can be a big help. The states that have extensive testing programs have found this to be really important. Look carefully at your laws and regs and see what changes you need to make to accommodate AVs. And remember, things are changing very rapidly. There is a new story virtually every day. I did a semi-research thing and went and looked at Google Scholar. You know Google Scholar? That's the place where you can find scientific studies on various things. And I put in autonomous vehicle or autonomous vehicles studies in the last year and a half, since January 2016. How many were there? More than 2,500 technical studies in the last year and a half. That's just how fast this game is changing. This is my wish list for what national organizations should do, and some of these are happening. There's a task force of AMVA, the Motor Vehicle Association, that is nearly finished with their model AV laws and regs for states. It's promised to be out in very early 2018. Yay. Document these issues that I've been talking about. It would be good to have a document that could be spread around the state so they don't have to worry about this themselves. Equally, public education materials. This has been mentioned by NHTSA as well. And bottom line, for a long time, law enforcement was not appropriately involved. They are now getting heavily more involved. IACP is playing a good role here. But my advice to you as states, if you're talking AVs, get law enforcement at the table because they are critical. As I said, NHTSA released guidance a month ago. It's voluntary, it's not regulatory, it's a framework, it's not detail. I won't talk about this in any great extent. I'll just mention that they have 12 points that the manufacturers and the developers of AVs should consider, and these are the 12 points. It's all available on NHTSA's website. For states, they are very much more general, just general principles, technology neutral, things about reporting and so forth. So you won't learn a lot about this from NHTSA. But this is level 2.0. NHTSA is working on guidance 3.0 already. It'll be out sometime next year. They want to talk to states. They're holding listening sessions and so forth. So get yourself involved either directly or through GHSA. GHSA is heavily involved in all of this. They're one of the players. They're writing comments and so forth and so on. I point out finally that there are 2 bills under consideration in the U.S. Senate and House right now of the issue of the federal-state role and what sort of preemption of state normal responsibilities for drivers and vehicles and so forth should the feds do or could the feds do. Again, that's happening very quickly, and GHSA is involved. You can't read this from the back, but this was last week's word. This was an editorial in the Sunday New York Times, and the headline says, "Not so fast on self-driving cars." Lots of words here, lots of issues. My advice, again, is be informed, think about it, and plan what you should do. There's me, there's the report. It's available for download. I encourage you to get that. And with that, we are going to move into a panel discussion with a chance for some back and forth on some of these really interesting questions. So, Jay, you're up.
Thank you, Jim. Excellent presentation. My name is Jay Hippis. I'm the state traffic engineer for MnDOT and also the TZD co-chair. A third hat that I wear is actually championing some of Minnesota's autonomous and connected vehicle efforts. We have a great panel today to talk a little more in depth about autonomous vehicles and the impact on Minnesota and the impact on TZD. So I'd like to welcome up our 3 panelists to the stage. While they're coming up to the stage, you'll hear a few things inside of their bios. You'll hear a reference to the AVCV Statewide Jurisdictional Committee. This is actually a group that we have here in Minnesota that includes MnDOT, Department of Public Safety, which includes State Patrol, Office of Traffic Safety, Vehicle Services, Department of Commerce with regulation, the Minnesota State Council on the Disabled, the Metropolitan Council. And we're starting to talk about some of the challenges that Jim talked about earlier. And then we have a group called Minnesota Guidestar Board of Directors, which is kind of bringing together academia, government, and the technology people to start talking about this is what's the impact of Minnesota. So we're going to dive into some of the questions here. It's going to be a panel discussion. And I'd like to welcome our additional 3 guests. First is Colonel Matt Langer, who's seated here in the middle. Colonel Langer has been with the Minnesota State Patrol since 1999. Before becoming the head of the State Patrol, he was involved with Metro Crash Reconstruction Team and the director of the State Patrol Fleet. Matt is involved with several autonomous and connected vehicle efforts here in Minnesota. He is part of the AVCV Statewide Jurisdictional Committee that I mentioned earlier and the Minnesota Guidestar Board of Directors. Tom Henderson, seated right here on my left, is with the Minnesota Department of Public Safety and is the program director for driver and vehicle services. He leads a team of 100 people responsible for vehicle titling and registration, commercial truck registration, fuel taxes, and auto dealer licensing. So Tom will probably have the biggest challenges with all the laws that Jim mentioned earlier. Tom also serves in our AV Statewide Jurisdictional Committee. And we also have Bernie Arsenault. He is the former chief engineer for MnDOT and one of the pioneers of the TZD program. Great to have Bernie back here. Currently, Bernie works for HDR and is the Highway and Roads Director, which is a national consulting firm. In his role, he helps clients prepare infrastructure for future needs, including autonomous vehicles. And Bernie is part of our Minnesota Guidestar Board of Directors. So we're not going to start with some softball questions. We're going to dive right into some of the hard questions here. The first one, so TZD brings the 4 E's, engineering, education, enforcement, and EMS together. What do you think that are going to be the biggest challenges facing Minnesota with regard to autonomous vehicles? So if you could address your E. And maybe I'll start with Bernie on this one on the engineering side.
Well, thanks, Jay. Yeah, it is awesome to be back and see that TZD is doing so well. And in fact, TZD is going to reap some pretty great rewards from this technology. But when you look from an engineering point of view, what the challenges are, I think they line up. There's many, obviously, but a couple I want to talk about is first, we're really going to challenge our traditional engineering standards. So when we think about the Green Book or the Highway Capacity Manual, all these tools that we have used for years, they are going to change dramatically. One of the things that TZD often talks about is speeds. Speed is not good, right? If we talked a little bit about going beyond the speed limit, but with autonomous vehicles, speed is not necessarily a bad thing, because these vehicles have the capabilities to provide higher levels of mobility by utilizing much smaller headways than we have and much higher speeds, because they're constantly interacting with the pavement, with the other vehicles to understand what the environment is like, much better than we as humans can do. There's another piece of this that it's hard to talk about AV without talking about CV, and that's the connected vehicle side. And that brings the infrastructure into play as well. And there are going to be a lot of infrastructure pertinences that are going to need to be added to our already cluttered highway system. So, I mean, those are some things that are going to have to be built in, and they're very different from what we've got today, because they allow vehicles to talk to each other, and they allow the infrastructure to talk to vehicles so that you can get information from a long ways away. The other thing, though, that I want to talk about is the fact that we're entering a time, a very exciting time, but one that is going to cause us to deal with people that we aren't used to dealing with. There are going to be many new stakeholders into this game, non-traditional stakeholders. If you just back up 15 years or so, we played with the same people for a long, long time in the highway side and the engineering side, Federal Highway, NHTSA, all those folks that we're very comfortable with dealing with, and we're very aware of the issues that are important to us as we move towards things like towards zero death and a safer environment. Now, TZD challenged those traditional relationships a little bit, in that we created a collaborative environment that brought DPS, that brought the educators, that brought others in, like MAD and other advocates, into this group so that we could begin to work together. That's a great start. But when we look at autonomous and connected vehicles, now we're beginning to look at Silicon Valley. We're looking at manufacturers, automakers like we never have dealt with them before. And it's going to be important for us to be able to collaborate and work together with them in order to move this forward. That is a very different paradigm than we've been using for the last approaching 100 years.
Colonel Langer, you want to go next? Talk about enforcement?
Well, thanks, Jay. I think the big challenge for us is moving from an incredibly traditional environment with statutes that were written, decades and decades ago, that relate to the things that law enforcement knows or legal folks in this room know. What's a driver? Well, we know what a driver is, but in a level 5 vehicle, what's a driver? What does it mean to be in operation of a vehicle or in physical control? And so a lot of the statutes that we have on the books for many years with case law that's well developed, we have a good understanding of what it means to drive or be in physical control of a vehicle, but not so much when you start moving from 0 up to 5 on the scale with autonomous vehicles. We sort of get lost, and then we look to the statutes for guidance, and we realize that the statutes don't give us any guidance when it comes to some of those issues moving forward. And so I think it's critical for some of the groups we have put together in Minnesota to really start looking at that, because the technology is here, it's available, but yet the statutes just are outdated for what we're talking about with what's available today, let alone in the next 5 years.
Well, as Colonel Langer said, as we consider it education, how are we going to train and evaluate drivers at the different levels of automation? And as Colonel Langer said, we do have a large body of knowledge on what those training and testing standards are going to be, but those are from days long gone by. And how are we going to adapt to the new standards of autonomous vehicles and adjust our training and testing procedures?
And Jim, maybe if you could address the EMS side. What happens with a crash with an autonomous vehicle? Do our EMS people need to know anything different in responding to a crash?
Well, basically, they need to know, is this an autonomous vehicle or not? If it is it shut off? Will it try to go home by itself? And the law enforcement issues are, how do I get information out of this that I need for my crash report? But let me add one other bit on the education side that Tom mentioned. Need to educate the general public as well about what are these vehicles, how do they operate, and how do you behave around them. That's something that can't occur, I think, just in DMVs, because it's not just the drivers, it's everybody.
All right, thank you. Tom, a quick question for you. Many believe that autonomous vehicles are going to provide a lot more mobility options for those who don't currently have it. For example, the disabled community, maybe people who've had their license revoked for habitual being impaired driving. How does driver and vehicle service envision licensing drivers for autonomous vehicles in the future?
Jay, when we think about driving testing and training right now, we think about two general categories. One is, can the person control the vehicle? And two, what is their decision making? So control, can you drive forward? Can you make left-hand turns? Can you back up? Can you parallel park? Decision making, do you know what the signs mean? And can you apply that situation that the sign is telling you to the situation you're seeing on the road? Can you adjust to traffic and weather conditions? We foresee those same general standards existing in certainly levels 1 through 4. But now we're going to have to probably train and test these drivers on both the physical control of the vehicle as well as the control of the vehicle in the autonomous mode. And that's going to be a bit of a challenge for us. Where it really gets interesting is going to be at level 5. Who's the driver? What does control mean at level 5? What does decision making mean at level 5? I was listening to Jim's presentation earlier, and he mentioned software updates. Perhaps verifying that the software is up to date, the person who is responsible for the vehicle has updated the software. Perhaps that will equal control. Without the software update, you're not in control of that vehicle. So it's going to be very challenging and very interesting for us at the highest level of automated driving.
All right, thank you. Jim mentioned states need to start thinking about these things and looking forward. Colonel Langer, I know you serve on the Autonomous Vehicle Jurisdictional Committee that I mentioned earlier. Do you want to share a little insights on what that committee is actually working on right now?
Well, that committee is getting together to wrestle with all the issues that everybody's thinking about today. And I would dare to say that almost everything that's passed through your mind that you think is, how are we going to deal with this? Or how does that jive with state statute? Or what does that do for law enforcement engineering? That's what this group is intended to tackle. We don't have any answers yet as a group, but we're working toward them. And I think the big key for us is to be connected and talking because and from my perspective, the last thing we want is other people to be driving this. We need to be driving this and moving it forward. And so when there's interest at the legislature about what's the state of Minnesota doing, we want them to be looking toward TZD and other groups like the CV-AV group we have put together to help say we're on the move, we're doing stuff and looking to us for guidance rather than be behind the curve. And the same as if we have a company that wants to come in and test in Minnesota, rather than have no structure, no ability to provide guidance, no where for them to turn, we want to have some system in place that we can allow them to come in and do it safely and then be aware of what's going on from a traffic safety perspective and an engineering perspective.
Great, thank you. Bernie, you're traveling all over the country, talking with a lot of different customers and clients about AV. For the audience out here, what can they start doing now with regard to connected autonomous vehicles?
Well, I think one of the first things to do is recognize that this is real, that it's happening. And we can debate the pace at which this is going to occur. I tend to think it's going to be more rapid, more quick than some of the data that's out there, because we've seen it with other things like your cell phone and things like that. But you really have to acknowledge it. And I am certain that in this room, there's everyone from innovation champions that want to just get right out in front of this thing and go, to reluctant adopters that are saying there's no way this is going to make it. It can't happen. And I'll tell you that if we were here a year ago, there would have been a lot more reluctant adopters. But the reality is people are seeing that this is truly on its way. I was recently in Kansas City, in fact, earlier this week, and we were talking about autonomous connected vehicles, and one of the guys came up and wanted to just query me about all the things that could go wrong with moving this forward. And we could stay there for 3 weeks and talk about all those things that might get in the way. But I prefer to focus on how do we, as stakeholders in this transformation into a new transportation system, support that growth. And so to that end, I would say that there are, just as Jim pointed out in his presentation, there is so much information out there that is available to you, and you ought to go out and look at it. And one of the ways to do it is, if you recognize that this is occurring, you also need to accept and realize that it's occurring across all modes and all functions. This is not just a highway thing. It is not just an enforcement thing. It's not just a transit thing, freight. It's everything. And it's going to impact you one way or the other. And so what I would suggest is you look at what you do and try and identify studies that are aligned with that. If you're in planning, if you're a 20-year plan preparer, you're involved in that, then I would begin to look at how do we future-proof those plans? How do we begin to develop scenario planning where we say, these look like the bookends of where we may be going. Now let's begin to insert that and integrate that into our plan. For those of you dealing with things that are maybe more current, including designing plans today, it is important to look at what are the things you can do to that plan, recognizing that in 5 or 10 or 15 years, we may be using that highway footprint very differently than we use it today. We may be segregating autonomous vehicles in a managed lane that only requires 8 feet. And that lane might have been in the past a shoulder that we constructed at full depth because we were looking forward and thinking about how we can future-proof this roadway. And that also includes power, it includes communication. There's so many things that you can do. And that's the thing. You don't have to do it all, but you need to do something.
Well, I think it's exciting. I think that's what we need to be doing. I think about just recent crashes in Minnesota that have really impacted us. And in some ways, I think autonomous vehicles are here today. They just happen to be driven by distracted drivers. I mean, those are vehicles that are going down the road at freeway speed and nobody's driving them, really, when you think about it. And so some of this technology that's coming is very exciting because it creates in my mind a vision where Officer Matthews in Wayzata, who's in the lane, and a driver is not watching, not paying attention, and is impaired. Is that a situation where an autonomous vehicle would have reacted and saved someone's life? Because it's being driven right now in a fashion where nobody's paying attention. So we can be critical about all the things and all the challenges and the infrastructure and, well, what about snow and what about ice? And that's all very valid. But the fact remains there's some really exciting stuff that will put someone in control of a vehicle being driven today by someone who's not in control because they're not even paying attention. So I think the number one thing we can do is be engaged and be excited about it and realize that it's coming and it's going to make our roads overall better.
Thank you. So the technology is coming. It's coming at a pace we don't really know. It might be coming quicker than we realize. Are there things that we can do with TZ that we can stop doing or reduce our efforts on with TZD? I'm just going to open it up to the panel in anticipation of autonomous vehicles.
All right. I'll just start. We've worked hard to change the paradigm within the safety arena. In the old days, we looked at hotspots, and we deal with 1, 2, 5, or 10 crashes a year that resulted in fatalities. We put in a bridge where an intersection was. It just didn't work. We have moved to a point of where now we're looking at the types of crashes, deploying proactive, systematic strategies and solutions to limit what we know are the major causes, like lane departure. So we put in rumble strips and on and on and on. You all know that. We are not going to be in an autonomous world tomorrow. There is no reason today to limit those efforts of towards zero death that we've been doing in Minnesota across all of these stakeholder groups I think it's really important that right now we keep our heads in the game and work towards those solutions that we've been working on for the past decade plus.
Do you have a comment, Jim?
I don't know how rapidly it will come, AVs, but they will be gradual. And as I tried to say at the end of my presentation, there'll be a fairly long time with both AVs and drivers on the road. As long as you have drivers on the road, you have to keep on doing what you're doing now. Do it well.
Just one more thought. You know, the rumble strips we put on the road can be a tool for the AVs as well, so that when they realize they're there, they can recognize that as another input to help maintain a safe operation.
Well, you know, a good friend of mine from church, we were sitting at our soccer game for our daughter, and he said he just bought a new Honda CR-V, and he looked for the technology. He wanted the Honda sensing package. He's a technology guy, commutes from Matamidi to the Mayo Clinic every day. And he said the first week he had the vehicle and he got used to it, he set the cruise control as he was northbound going home, and he never took it off, the adaptive cruise control, all the way from Rochester to St. Paul on 52, even through a work zone. And so at first, you know, we kind of cringe and go, oh my gosh, a work zone. But back to my point, I'd argue it's probably better. That vehicle was paying attention, and he was fascinated by how the vehicle navigated through that work zone, slowed down with the traffic, sped up after it was out of the work zone. And those of us that work enforcement engineering, EMS, we know what happens in work zones. The biggest challenge is with the backup and the slowdown. And so I think what we have to do is maybe stop cringing at some of this technology. Our grandparents would have probably said, don't use the cruise control because it's not safe. Now we're saying use the cruise control because arguably it's better. That vehicle's likely better than any of us in this room at paying attention to what's going on in front of us, and it's available now and people want it.
So many think that AV is, we may have touched on this already, but in case we want to expand upon that, AV is going to be the next big thing to significantly reduce traffic-related fatalities and serious injuries. What do you think and why? Is this the silver bullet?
I don't know that it's a silver bullet, because as those in the State Patrol, there's always going to be an Oldsmobile Alero on the road somewhere in Minnesota. Sometimes I say the district, but I don't want to offend anybody, but there'll always be one of those on the road. And so how many years is it going to, if this is the silver bullet, how many years do we get to the point where we're at that tipping point where there's more CVs on the road than there are Oldsmobile Aleros? And I think that's going to be the challenge as this stuff comes. Like Bernie said, we can debate the timeline. Undeniably, it's coming. I you know, in my mind, wrestle with where's going to be that tipping point where this is the norm. You know, Uber once upon a time was novel and fascinating and cutting edge, and now it is just what you do when you travel. That happened a lot quicker than probably people would think.
Well, I would start by asking the question, which I asked many times when I was in the TZD program, you know, day in and day out as a traffic engineer. How many of you believe that we can achieve zero fatalities on our roadways? Zero traffic fatalities? Boy, it's still pretty close to what it used to be, but I do. I absolutely believe that. And it was a lot more of a challenge to get to that place in your mind where it could occur 10 years ago when we were doing this. But now with this technology, as Matt has pointed out, this is possible. There is no question that safety is the biggest driver for autonomous and connected vehicles. When you go around the country and you see those big drivers like Michigan, Colorado, Florida, you talk to those leaders in that, and the reason they're pushing this is because of the safety implications and the benefits that are going to be achieved through that. Now, will there be a transition period? Absolutely. Will there be those Aleros or my 2004 Grand Prix with 246,000 miles on it? Yeah, they will be out there. But those cars are even in a better place than they are today because the vehicles around them are going to be watching for them. So I absolutely believe that this technology, amongst many other things, is going to help us get to zero.
Bernie, we did a study, don't feel bad, 75% of law enforcement officers can't raise their hand for any reason, so don't worry.
Jim, did you want to add something to that conversation?
Yes, they will make a major difference. And the thing I'd leave you with in the meantime, in the transition period, is the perfect is the enemy of the good. There will be some crashes involving AVs as they begin to be introduced, but we shouldn't say, no, they're bad, because look, one crashed. Nationally, there were more than 30,000 fatalities last year due to driver error. If you cut that by 90% down to 3,000, is that a big improvement? That certainly is. Go for the gains you can make now and don't worry about the last one.
I agree with Colonel Langer when he said, I wish this were a silver bullet. Automated vehicles were a silver bullet. I'm not sure that that's going to be. I do think the transition period between driver and driverless vehicles is probably going to be a lot longer than we probably hope. When you look at the tails of the vehicle fleets, we have vehicles from the 1950s that are still out there driving each and every day. They're going to exist probably well within my driving lifetime.
All right, we talked about a lot of things today. You can see there's a lot more questions than there are answers when it comes to autonomous and connected vehicles. But this is the panel's last chance to give final comments on your perspectives related to your E or any perspectives in general. So some closing comments from the panel. I'll start with Tom.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we envision at GVS, we envision the transition between level 4 and level 5 in how we license and train our drivers is going to be a pretty significant change for us and for the state of Minnesota. But on the vehicle side, however, we think that we could probably bring these vehicles on, register, license them, get them on the road right now. It'd be better if we had a little bit more legislation specifically authorizing them, but we believe that we can do that right now. For training, we're going to have to do a lot of work to change our current laws, our current administrative rules on training. They're pretty specific, and they're specific that probably for the 60s and 70s. So that's going to be a lot of work for us.
Colonel Langer?
Just from the enforcement perspective, I think we need to be engaged and active with what's going on. And so opportunities to visit the auto show, both as a consumer, just as one example, is a good thing, but as a professional, it's a good idea too, to be able to see the technology that's out there now and to ask questions, because a lot of it is available, like in various segments, various pieces, not fully autonomous, but available. And not that long ago, people were complaining because cars went up by $900 a year because you had to buy anti-lock brakes because that became a requirement. And I don't know if that's going to happen with some of this technology, but I think we're seeing a shift, and people they're buying, a Honda because they want the sensing package, or a Toyota because of this, or they're buying Ford, or they want Apple CarPlay or whatever. They're looking for that and buying it, and I think they're eager to get that technology instead of being frustrated about the cost of it. So our biggest challenge is becoming aware and staying current with what's available.
Thank you, Bernie.
Okay, so transportation is always going to be a critical part of everyone's life. It's not going away. There needs to be transportation, and it needs to be safe and efficient. This technology enhances safety, it enhances opportunities for mobility, and ultimately then enhances the quality of life of everyone. So it's really important that us as transportation professionals get into this game and begin to understand it and implement it in our daily lives, because we have the possibility to impact that quality of life of everyone. Beyond that, we can even go further, and this is a whole new topic, but we can go beyond our traditional transportation challenges into the societal challenges. Homelessness, access to work, health issues. All these things can be addressed through a better transportation system that allows access to the disabled, the disadvantaged, and the elderly. So we can do great things as transportation professionals, and it's incumbent on all of us to get in and figure out how to make this work in the things that we do every day.
Thank you, Bernie. Jim?
Well, I had 20 minutes, so I'll just reiterate a couple of things. Be informed, stay informed, be a player. Don't sit on the sidelines, because this will happen. The perfect is the enemy of the good, so don't hold back. I wrote a paper once on highway safety called "The Lone Ranger is Dead. There is no silver bullet." But keep on pushing. And yes, it'll make a great deal of difference to society across. The vision is great. Let's get there.
just want to let the audience know too that just earlier this week, a level 4 vehicle has shown up in Minnesota. So this vehicle is an Easy Mile shuttle. It's a small 6 to 12 passenger electric vehicle, and it's going to be up at our Min Road facility from now until about the Super Bowl. So MnDOT, in cooperation with our partners from the other state agencies, are going to run it through a series of tests. We're going to run it through some snow tests, some ice tests, some salt conditions. So we're really looking forward to this first time this vehicle coming to Minnesota. As part of it too, it's actually going to go downtown Minneapolis as part of the Super Bowl, so the public will actually have a chance to ride the vehicle. It's going to operate on Nicollet Mall for the weekend before the Super Bowl and a few days leading up to the Super Bowl. So you'll see some announcements probably in the press coming out about that, but a great opportunity to actually see one of the vehicles and touch one of the vehicles. I've been in the vehicle before. You walk in and then there's no steering wheel, there's no pedals, and the vehicle just operates. It can't go anywhere. It's kind of on a fixed path that it goes, but a great opportunity to show that Minnesota is getting actively involved in learning about the technology. So I think this was a great discussion today. I'd like to have everybody thank the panel members. So Jim will be available at the front of the room to answer questions one-on-one during the upcoming break. Reminder that there are additional announcements in your program and in your conference mobile app, including information about continuing education credits. Please break outside of your E and attend a breakout session for a different one. I know the engineering ones are going to be fantastic, speaking from the engineering side, so I expect all law enforcement to be in the engineering ones today. I know that won't happen, but I can make a plug for it. Make sure you visit the exhibit tables at the ballroom. And then a final reminder, there's a reception this afternoon at 4:30 in the ballroom. Hope you can join us. So thank you and have a great conference.